Hello and good evening, everyone. I'm Randall Miller, Director of Dance and Special Projects for the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Cultural Trust to tonight's program for the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival at Home. The festival is a co-production between the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust and the Humanities Center of Carnegie Mellon University. And I would now like to invite my co-director, David Shumway from the Humanities Center at Carnegie Mellon, to say a few words. David?
Thanks, Randall. Hello and welcome. Since 2015, the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival has been bringing smart talk about stuff that matters to the people of Pittsburgh. We're pleased to be able to continue to do that today and every Wednesday month. Randall.
Thanks, David. And now I would like to give you an introduction to Dan Fitzpatrick from our presenting sponsor, Citizens Bank.
Hello, I'm Dan Fitzpatrick, President of Citizens Bank for the Mid-Atlantic region. I want to thank you all for tuning in to the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival. As you know, 2020 was a very challenging year, and the challenges of 2020 still persist today. This is why we at Citizens are happy to support the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival, because it provides for meaningful dialogue and connection right when we need it most. It's extremely important to support programs that create positive connections and impacts on our communities. And although we cannot gather in person for the program, we're proud to share in this virtual tradition with you. We hope that these interviews with artists, academics, and intellectual innovators working to make Pittsburgh and our world a better place will not only lead you to think and reflect on the issues facing our communities, but to take meaningful action to help bring about change. So thank you again to the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust for hosting the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival. We're grateful and we look forward to joining the discussions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Citizens Bank, for their support. Produce programs like the Humanities Festival at Home. If any of you viewers would wish to help us with some financial support, please visit trustarts.org/supporthumanities. Please be aware that our speakers will answer a few audience questions at the end of the program. You can submit those questions as comments on either YouTube or Facebook, the live streams that you're watching currently, and we will take a few of those questions at the end. I'll now hand it back over to David Shumway to introduce our speakers for tonight.
It is now my pleasure to invite you to join in conversation with Dr. Daphne A. Brooks, one of the most important and influential scholars of popular music. Dr. Brooks is William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of African American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Music at Yale University, and an award-winning Black feminist music critic. She will discuss her newest book, Liner Notes for the Revolution: The Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound. She'll be interviewed by Terry Bell. Terry is Vice President of Strategic Partnerships and Community Engagement for the Cultural Trust, where she works to develop strategies to engage underrepresented communities and to develop partnerships and alignment with organizations, artists, and community groups. Her portfolio includes the BNY Mellon Presents Jazz Live and Women's History Months. Daphne and Terry.
Hello, Daphne.
Hello, Terry.
Welcome to the Humanities Festival. I am so honored to be here with you tonight. Congratulations and thank you for this important work. I really enjoyed it. It's so densely packed with information. I learned so many things, and I thank you for taking me on that journey. And for
thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you to the entire team of the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival for making it possible for us to have this conversation.
Well, let's get started. So I'd like to first give you the opportunity to just give us an overview of the book. Tell us what it's about.
Yeah. Thanks. I usually start by asking people to imagine a sweeping history of Black women in popular music culture across the centuries that encapsulates a focus on their virtuosity, their craft, their contributions to American culture and the global cultural life. And then I say, if you're having trouble thinking of a book like that, that's the story that I tell in my book. So my book is actually about cultural institutions. It's about power. It's about record collectors and recording industry label heads, and especially music critics who had particular ideas about what counts, what should be defined as excellent, and how to define Black music. And if we walk through that history, which I try to do in part, you get to the core of a story that's about racial and gender and class hierarchies, and kind of chronic devaluing of Black women's popular music contributions, especially in the context of the modern recording industry, beginning in 1920 when Mamie Smith broke through and became the first African-American to record the blues, crazy blues, in 1920. But the book is not just about that story of power and subjugation. It's about the ways in which Black women musicians and Black feminist scholars and creatives and thinkers, as well as white allies, as our next gen thinkers might call them, engaged in their own kind of vernacular grassroots practices in caring for Black women's music and writing about the music themselves and giving lectures and documenting their relationship to the music in diaries and journals and epistolary exchanges. It's about women like my mother, who's 94 years old in California, knock on wood, and the stories for her of going to the Jim Crow record store, growing up in Texarkana in the 1930s and 40s. So it's a counter history of Black women in popular music culture that is centered by the stories of the feminists who cared for the music when dominant culture either didn't or wasn't able to deeply value all of the different ways that the music matters.
Again, very, very important work, and thank you for that overview. While we're there, I just want to talk about the book itself. Like, as soon as I saw the cover of this, I thought about a time in my life, and it just drew me in. And so there is this image of a woman lying on her back, listening to her vinyl with this eclectic taste in music. She's listening to a Rosetta Records compilation and Beyonce at the same time.
That is true.
Yes.
If I may just quickly interrupt you, that is an archival Smithsonian image that then my team at Harvard University Press creatively doctored with public domain work. So she's not actually listening to Beyonce. Okay. But in our world, she's listening to the blues and to Beyonce to encapsulate the narrative of the book. But we digress. Yeah.
No, but I appreciate you giving us that information about that image, because it definitely did speak to me. But I want to talk also a little bit about the title, Liner Notes for the Revolution, the Intellectual Life of Black Feminist Sound. Of course, those in my age group understand all about the liner note, but it's something that we don't talk about, we don't hear about, we don't see that much. Can you speak a little bit to the historical significance of the liner note, and what made you choose this as the title for this work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. So, right, liner notes for record geeks, we're well aware of what they are. And I even said to a class of students online at Smith College earlier today, if you're on the call and you're under 40, you're not going to know what these things are for the most part, right?
Right.
But, they came into prominence, especially in the mid 20th century, in the 1950s, with the rise of the 33 1/3 disc. And originally they kind of operated almost as one of my colleagues has called them, blurbs, like long form blurbs about this is what's so great about this record and you should buy it. But as jazz music criticism especially began to unfold and become a really prodigious and rigorous site of cultural theory and cultural criticism, led by figures like Ralph J. Gleason and Ira Gettler and Leonard Feather, and of course the late great Nat Hentoff. They were writing notes about all of the jazz heavyweights that were long form essays that wrote alongside the music in many ways, that tried to capture what was important about the recording. It could be filled with historical details linked to how the recording came into being, who the players were, chocked full of information. And then over time, you even had artists like John Coltrane himself or Frank Zappa or famously Bob Dylan, who wrote their own, deeply eccentric notes that matched Sun Ra, that matched the creativity of their their vision, right? There were notes that were written by Black women musicians. Odetta is one. There were also notes that were written by Black feminists about Black women's recordings, like Chilani Davis, the veteran arts journalist who was the first Black woman to win a Grammy for writing liner notes. But for the most part, it was really a dude's game. I mean, it was dominated by the critics who loved, a cadre of canonical jazz and rock musicians. I grew up loving the notes and trying to learn everything that I could about a particular recording. And I've come to find in talking to so many different women of all ages, or I guess 40 and up, that they too love the liner notes genre. And what I really wanted to do in titling the book Liner Notes for the Revolution is both to call attention to the project that I was engaging in, that I was actually trying to write a kind of very, 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 very long right notes to the history that I just described, which meant that I'd want to try to approximate something that was intimate, that was able to draw out all sorts of historical details about different moments in Black women's popular music history, that, also honored the music itself. But the other question that I usually get asked about the title is, well, what is the revolution, right? And the revolution operates along a kind of twin axis. It's both the kind of writing that I feel is needed in order to actually care for all of these Black women musicians that have received disproportionately less critical love and interest from the writer class of critics, of which I mentioned. And it's also the music itself, innovated by communities of women who were violently disenfranchised, that come from people who've, were once defined as commodities and yet made some of the most impactful art in the modern era. So that's how the title came to be.
Thank you for that. So I want to talk a little bit about your style of writing. It speaks to so many different audiences. Of course, this book would be perfectly at home, obviously, in spaces of academia, but you seem to be able to strike this balance between academia and broader accessibility. Much like you talk about in your book, Zora Neale Hurston, is having one foot planted in Ivy League academia and the other standing firmly in the realm of quotidian African-American culture. So was this your intention? Who are you trying to reach? In this book, you talk about Black scholars, fans of the music, critics, collectors. And what do you hope that this book inspires in all of us?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. And it means a great deal to me if the writing can move like that. In trying to get close to and to write alongside that revolution that I was just describing, it felt very important to think about all of the multiple publics, as we call it in academia, all of those different communities who love the music. I wanted to be able to create a kind of a commons space in my writing that could also absorb and honor and manifest all of the different influences on my thinking. So as I've often said publicly, much to my mother's chagrin, again, 94 years old, I was like, well, I was a menopause baby, okay? What does this have to do with my writing? It means that I grew up in a household that was much older than me. My late father and my mom, Great Migration, migrants who escaped the Jim Crow South of Texas and Arkansas in 1950 and moved to Berkeley, where my father went to graduate school. They both became teachers. They had two children in 1951 and in 1958, and they thought they were done. And then I came along in 1968, and I absorbed all that music, the big bands of my dad's beloved stereo on repeat, the kind of the classic R&B, elegant R&B of somebody like Billy Eckstine, who my mother loved, but also the Temptations that my brother loved, and all that Motown. And my sister are kind of moving into the era of integrated schooling, absorbing Barbra Streisand and Barry Manilow, along with the Jackson 5 and Chaka Khan. So I loved all that music, but I too, as a Gen Xer, was going to integrated schools. I ended up listening to and loving The Clash and the rock band The Police and Prince. And That led me out of my house because no one had time for me in my house with all that music. So still, how do we get to voice? We get to voice by taking the bus down the El Camino Real in Menlo Park in Palo Alto, California to Tower Records and spending hours upon hours in the magazine section of Tower Records, in addition to buying all of those discs and reading Rolling Stone magazine and Cream, even Hit Parade, and trying to find these sites for conversations about the music. But I was drawn to this kind of, gonzo music journalism that, was, I think our young ones would call it today unapologetic, but unapologetic from like a swaggering white guy's kind of convictions about the rock and roll that they loved. And I thought I had to be able to claim that voice too. And I really held on to that, but I also held on to the Black feminist literature that my sister was bringing home to me in the 70s from Mills College, where she was as an undergrad, and reading Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and Ntozake Shange. I felt like being able to fuse those types of voices and also the politics, the radical politics tied to both of those forms in the service of Black women's music could maybe reach all of those publics at once. And that felt very important to me because, Black study, as I've said in a couple of different contexts, I am a scholar of African American studies, but Black study precedes the institution of Black studies and departments of African American studies by hundreds of years. And so I thought maybe this book could be a contribution to that much longer tradition of Black study that happens in the record shop and, happens when one is sitting reading a review of Al Green or Minnie Riperton. Black study is what Frederick Douglass was calling us to do in 1845 when, he was demanding that, we open ourselves up to a different kind of literacy that was, about equality and justice. So that's the spirit of why I wanted this book to be able to really travel to many different communities. Many different kinds of readers. I guess the last thing I'll say is that I've been very moved by the fact that I've had this wild cross-section of some of my friends' kids who are in high school who are reading the book and using it for their book reports, musicians who've contacted me who say, I gave this to my mother, right? And, people, I got a note from someone I don't know across the country who'd gone to the public library and picked it up and felt that the book spoke to him about something that had been lost in American culture. And that's just been really, really gratifying.
Well, I think you were very successful in that. I picked up a second copy and sent it to my best friend, and we had this little book club going on. So anyway, it's
great.
Yes. So I want to talk about some of the women. We meet so many women in the book. Musicians, critics, writers, critical thinkers, and some that are all of that at the same time. All contributors in their own way to this rich history and leaving their own archive along the way. There's a couple who spoke to me who I learned about in your book. Those were Pauline Hopkins from side A and Gishi, Wiley, and Elvi Thomas from side B. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those women and why they're significant. And then also tell us, as you did your research, if there's any women that spoke to you in a particular way as you learned more about them.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you. Pauline Hopkins, I've been obsessed with since I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. So I followed that trail of both my dad going to UC Berkeley and it being the site for early rock music criticism that, again, goes to my obsessions with the form. Pauline Hopkins was a 19th century, early 20th century freedom fighter. She was, she started out young, many historians don't know, as a vocalist. And then transitioned into being a playwright. The earliest extant Black musical we have on record, Peculiar Sam, was written by her. She then became a magazine editor for the Colored American magazine. She wrote serialized novels, as well as one freestanding novel, Contending Forces. All were early Black feminist, anti-lynching manifestos, anti-Black terror manifestos. And she used all sorts of popular forms in order to, weave these really majestic narratives about Black life. One of those novels was Of One Blood, in which she imagines this just stunning journey of a Fisk Jubilee singer who's also a spiritualist. One of the things that I thought about with Pauline Hopkins, having written about her again since I was an undergrad, and then she appears in my first academic monograph, was that she really was our first Black music critic in many ways, our first Black women's music critic, someone who was interested in writing about Black women in sound and thinking about the politics of Black women in sound. And so I really wanted to honor her. I wanted to think about, what it was like on a daily basis to really try to capture in print what Black music meant to her and meant to her generation of African Americans who were still so touched by slavery and slavery's long shadow, as well as anti-lynching terror. So she's where the book really takes off in many ways. In side B, these two figures.
Just a heads up, we're at close to 5 minutes, so finish this one off, one more, and then I'll come back. Those viewers at home, sorry to interrupt, by the way, but those viewers at home, get your questions in the comments, please, and we'll be taking them shortly.
Thanks, Randall. This will be shorter because we know so little about these women, which is many of the reasons why they're intriguing to me and to my fellow Black music thinkers, or thinkers about Black music in some ways. Gishi, Wiley, and Elvi Thomas, they were blues musicians who we believe were originally based, at least at some point, or met in Texas. They end up recording only 6 sides for Paramount Records, one of the greatest race records labels of all time. In many ways, they recorded so much and so many history-making endeavors. Gishi, Wiley, and Elvi Thomas, of their 6 sides, one song in particular, Last Kind Words Blues, has been written about by a number of just towering critics of blues music and popular music more generally. People like my mentor and interlocutor, he's one of my mentors and interlocutors, Grail Marcus, John Jeremiah Sullivan, but also a lot of record collectors, again, white male record collectors across the 20th century, obsessed with this song. But there's not much we know about them. They kind of disappeared, as many people have described them, into the historical, opaque shadows. I wanted to tell the story of how we might think about their disappearance as opposed to looking for them. Trying to find out more about them has been important. But I thought that a kind of disproportionate emphasis on looking for just them and not thinking about all of the women and girls who valued their music, or the ones that valued music that was related to Gishi and Elvi's time, so blues music more broadly, that those stories needed to be told. And so that's why I ended up interviewing and including the reflections of my mother, as well as the great Marcia Music, who's the daughter of one of the legendary record store owners in Detroit, and so many other figures that I wanted to try to think differently about how to tell the story of why and how blues women's music mattered to Black women and girls. So Gishi, Wiley, and Elvi Thomas, I'd be forever grateful to them for allowing me to tell that story.
Well, I'm grateful for being introduced to them through your work. And while we have this time to get one more in, and we're talking a little bit about this, side B gets into the archives, and there's a question that's posed to you about the elusive history of Gishi and Elvi. What if they don't want to be found? Yeah. And I thought about that question, and I thought about, you as you were doing your research and navigating the archives and pouring through things never revealed, and just how you make the decision and how you balance the respect for perhaps the intention of not being found with your obligation to bring things to light in your work. And how you dealt with that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And the question was posed to me by the great queer theorist Jack Halberstam, who's a very good friend of mine. And Daphne, what if these women don't want to be found? And I think that part of what I tried to do in the book too was, number one, make it very visible and audible, the kinds of conversations that I've been having with all of my interlocutors about this music, to tell this story as a shared story of how we experience music, how we're challenged by others to think about the music, but also then to have the story of the question about what to do with their disappearance be a kind of object of inquiry, right? Rather than trying to answer the question, to be able to hold up the question as its own kind of plot line, if that makes sense at all. I also am remembering you asked me too, Terry, about figures we're drawn to. And one figure I'm drawn to deeply in Side A, who also raised ethical questions for me, is Lorraine Hansberry, who people know as the great legendary playwright of Raisin in the Sun, also a fantastically bold and fearless and brilliant Black feminist queer theorist, who was deeply immersed in thinking about her intersectional identity formations. And what moved me about her archive is that she paid so much attention to her own cataloging, her own thoughts, her own desires. She famously had a legal pad in which she would write down every year her likes and her dislikes. But to the question of what to do with that material, it came back to, does she want this public? These are private notes, right? Mm-hmm. And I think again, as academics, we're kind of faced with trying to honor the privacy, especially of Black women who've been denied historically privacy, right? As people who are subject to all sorts of violations. If we aren't reminded by that as a people, once again this week, then I don't know what we're reminded of. But at the same time, to at least call attention to the practice of her engaging her own life of the mind. And so rather than lingering on a breach of privacy, I wanted to really call our attention to the fact that someone like a Lorraine Hansberry, or a Pauline Hopkins has a private creative life of the mind. And I think that I hope makes sense in relation to Gishi, Wiley, and Elvi Thomas too, that to even pose the question of maybe it's their prerogative to disappear, in a world in which Black people are perpetually surveilled. That's important. That's as important to the history of the music as their appearance in the recording studio is.
Absolutely. Before Randall jumps back in, we had a little conversation before we went on air, and I told you I was listening to music and jamming my way all the way through this book, and you talked about a playlist. Yes. That can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there it is. So I have to thank my amazing research assistants, Fawn Trong and Amy Dupuy, who put together this playlist that follows the arc of the book, both in terms of tracks that are cited, musicians that are cited, but also ideas that are related to twists and turns on the book. So that's the Spotify list. It's the liner notes for the Revolution Spotify playlist. And I will say that it is more than 9 hours long. So one can read it, one can listen to it as one reads the book probably several times. Or maybe vice versa. Maybe you're putting it on repeat play sometimes to get through this book. But.
Well, I wish I had known about that playlist when I was Googling and Apple Musicing and all those sorts of things. But yes, thank you so much for that. And I think we've got Randall back.
Yeah, here I am. This has been a great conversation. It feels a little condensed given that we're working on a 600-page book in a 30-minute talk. So thank you both for this. And just a note for those of us watching at home, that the Spotify playlist has been posted in the comments to both YouTube and Facebook. So if you're looking for it, it's accessible through that. We have time for 2 questions, which I'll start. And this first one is a multi-parter. Actually, I'll start with the easy, short question, and then we'll go to the multi-parter and wind out the time. So the short question is, what's up next for you? Is there another book in the works? What projects are you working on?
Thanks for that question. Yes, there is. So believe it or not, and Terry, I'm glad you're sitting down, but this book was longer. There was a third part before it was a side A and a side B. third part was the story of Black women musicians for nearly 100 years, 85 years to be more precise, who performed in Porgy and Bess, who worked as arrangers, directors, vocalists, actors. The reason why Porgy and Bess was important to me in relation to liner notes is because each of those women were working with what I have always believed is an anti-Black archive. Porgy and Bess is actually literally has roots in blackface minstrelsy, which people have forgotten. And yet some of our most genius musicians have moved through that repertoire and transformed it into Black feminist life. And that includes the recording of Summertime, of which it is the most recorded cover of all time. And all of the superstars, Black women in popular music culture, practically, with maybe the exception of Aretha. I did have an exchange with Aretha, may she rest, about Gershwin, but they've moved through that repertoire. So that's the next book. That's, I've written much of it already because it belonged in this book. And then there are a couple more installments that are related to liner notes, believe it or not, that move across the rest of the 20th century and up through Beyonce and her sister Solange. So as my dean said here at Yale, you're going to be writing this in the rest home, Daphne. Well, at least I have something to do. Okay?
All right, time for our last question. It's a multi-parter, but not really. It's kind of one question, but three questions. So you write with an understanding of and appreciation for music and sound that speaks to a great depth of understanding. Did you play or write music? What did you listen to? And what is the foundation of your sonic journey?
Wow, that's great. Did I play? What did I listen to? Foundation of sonic. Wow, this is incredible. How much time do we have, Randall?
A couple minutes, so condense it if you can.
All right. Yeah. So thank you for those comments. Like many a Black middle class girl across time, really, there is really a tradition that the historian Robin Kelly has talked about that needs to be marked, of Black women who grew up, or Black girls who grew up with piano lessons. So I did play piano through high school. I also played clarinet poorly. I had my older sister just crushed on the clarinet, and I could not do it. So during my grunge years, I picked up a guitar and took piano lessons, but guitar lessons, but that was short-lived since I had a dissertation to write. So it's been important to me both to have had a foundation. I have different things to say about that, but I also feel very lucky to be in a world of musicians now. So I'm better off talking to a Jason Moran or a Cecile McClure, right? Or anybody else about craft and intricacies related to instrumentality. But thank you for that. What did I listen to? Everything. I know that's such a boring question, but it was really, really everything. And I guess maybe to reference again, the household that I came up in, I got, kind of Black musical traditions across the post-war era through my parents and my older siblings, and then my own kind of life, and integrated Palo Alto and Berkeley, much more integrated in Berkeley than Palo Alto. I got a lot of alternative music that meant a lot to me too. And I'm a child of the hip hop generation. So, and the foundations of my sonic life, I think it was something very lyrical like that. I'm going to say Toni Morrison, and I've written a little bit about her relationship to Black music. I was deeply honored to be her colleague for a bit at Princeton. But had met her when I was an undergrad at Berkeley. Her son Ford was at Berkeley when I was there, and she was in residence at Berkeley when Beloved came out. I teach a class in Toni Morrison. This is the second time I've done it, and her entire body of work. And I think what she reminds me and reminds all of us is about the urgencies of the matter of Black life, about the ways that Blackness matters in our larger human universe, but also about how we ethically relate to each other as human beings, what it means to actually acknowledge the importance of being humane to one another and seeing one another deeply, and intricate and complex ways, that's the way to save communities that are in crisis. You see that in all of her works. And I hear that in Black music and Black women's music. So the relationship between Toni Morrison and the foundations of my sonic life are very strong. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. That's all we have time for this episode of the Pittsburgh Humanities Festival at Home. I'd like to invite David Shumway, our co-director, back onto the screen as we say goodnight. I'm so glad we were able to make this conversation today happen despite the pandemic, which hopefully is waning. And I know that it will inspire thought, introspection, and further conversation among our viewers. So thank you, Daphne. Thank you, Terry. Thank you, David, for making this all possible tonight. And please consider, I have to hit you all up one more time, please consider making a financial contribution to support our mission and future programming at trustarts.org/supporthumanities. I hope you'll have a great week, and please tune in for the rest of the month on Wednesday nights throughout April for more smart talk about stuff that matters. Have a good night.
Thank you.